Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the presentation on the evolving national crisis and its impact on business. It's the second part. Thank you for coming this morning. We're going to allow a minute or so for people to log on, and then we'll get started. So at 11:01, we'll start the presentation. Once again, good morning, everyone. I'm Ashford Chancelor. I'm the practice manager for the North Texas region of vcfo, and we have a content-laden presentation for you, full of hopefully a lot of thought-provoking information. But before we get started, I wanted to take a step back. You know, as I said before, this is the title of this is The Evolving National Crisis and Its Impact on Business is part 2. But I wanted to step back and talk a little bit about why we're here and what we're doing. So if we can go to the next slide, we can see that, oh, I'm sorry. Well, this is actually me. I'm the practice manager, and I have had, as you can see, that's a pre-pandemic photo of me. I don't look like that anymore, but I've had about 30 years of experience as a CFO in the triad of accounting. It's been for Big Four, nonprofit, and for-profit. During those 30 years, I've worked in a lot of different industries, but with a concentration on technology, energy, and some real estate. I have been schooled in all that time in everything from startups to large companies. I've been a consultant for about 6 years, and I have, during that time, my portfolio of clients has primarily focused on companies that are getting themselves ready to be acquired or to raise capital, so a lot of due diligence. And it's been a great experience. So with that, let's go to the next slide. One of the things that talk about vcfo is that we are celebrating our 25th year. And in that time, we have 5,000, we serviced 5,000 clients in a wide spectrum of industries, all the way from startups to companies with over $100 million in revenue. And how do we do that? We offer fractional CFO, controller, assistant controller, human resource, and recruiting solutions. And we have offices in Austin, Dallas, Houston, and Denver. And so with that, let's go to the next slide. I'd like to introduce, or actually have my co-host, co-presenter, Jim Savage, who brings an enormous amount of expertise, wisdom, insight, and a lot of humor to this series. Jim, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ashford, and good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. Like Ashford, I don't look like that anymore. My ties think I'm dead. So but I had a company called Kingsbrae Global that we have people across North America, and what we really do is help companies and brands of all types and sizes to become the leaders in their field, the reputation leaders and the market leaders. So that's everything from thought leadership to, we have a partnership with a great marketing organization, HCK2, based in Dallas. And we are really, as you'll see as we go through the presentation, we try to work with companies to elevate their ability to really acquire market share in a thoughtful and deliberate way. So it's a non-traditional type of marketing and marketing approach.
Great, thank you, Jim. And Jim's going to talk to us later on in this webinar, both about risk identification and mitigation, and also how to help prepare your corporate management team navigate through the turbulence that we're seeing. So with that, I want to step back and just talk a little bit about what we're doing here. This is, even though we haven't built it like this much externally, this is a thought leadership series. And it's part 2 of a 4-part continuum of learning, which really means we had our first webinar in March, having this one now. We're going to have 2 more in either the July-August timeframe or the October-November timeframe. And the To be a thought leaders generally pioneer new ideas and rather than following conventional wisdom. And so the overarching themes that appear in all four of these webinars, we're moving beyond conventional wisdom. We're looking at things outside of that, and we're gonna talk about several examples about where moving beyond conventional wisdom has paid enormous dividends. And we're also going to be establishing contextual awareness. As we review the historical cycles, it's going to bring to you a new framework about how we got where we are, why we're here, what's happening when we're here, and then what's coming. And the goal in all of this is really two or threefold. We want to establish learning mediums through webinars like this, hopefully some face-to-face meetings coming soon, and then some social media communities, probably on LinkedIn, where we get together, where thought leaders can come to discuss ideas on the tectonic changes reshaping our society. And so before we go further, I took some time before I started this whole series, and because I wanted to establish the reason why I was doing this. And so I wrote this several weeks ago, and I just wanted to read to you because we all get very caught up in the day-to-day hubbub of life and turmoil, and we're missing some huge context about where we are. And so 3 weeks ago, I wrote, it says, we stand today at the juncture or nexus of the most consequential moment in human history. A review of the historical cycles that we'll be learning about in a few minutes show that we are in a very perilous time, a more dangerous time than most people imagine, and what we do in the next few years will dramatically shape the destiny of this nation. And at the same time, we are about to experience and are experiencing a wave of technological innovation that will change the very fabric of reality. So with that, we are bringing to you a context of where we are, making us aware there are bigger patterns that are really shaping our society beyond what we just read, see, hear about in the news. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Let's keep going. So this is the storyline, and all four webinars are built with this same framework. In the first part of each webinar, we're going to be talking about historical cycles and relating back to how historical cycles are impacting our current reality. And we, as we'll see soon, we are in a segment of an historical cycle that's largely unseen, in which, as everybody can feel, it's creating turbulence on a scale and with an intensity that's never been experienced before by the current generations, the baby boomers, the Gen X's, the millennials, the generation Y, Z. And as a result, like the stress indicators in the political, culture, economic, and environmental systems are all flashing red. And we're going to see evidence of that as we go through this webinar. The chaos caused by the pandemic is easing now in the United States, and many people think and actually long to go back to the comfortable familiarity of the pre-pandemic world, but we won't be going back to that. So we're going to talk at that contextual framework is what's happening about historical cycles. And then in part two, we're going to be talking about business strategies. As I said earlier in my comments, we're navigating through a very perilous time with not many tools in our toolbox that allow us to understand the bigger things of what's happening. So we're going to look at business strategies, looking beyond conventional wisdom that are going to help us do this. And at the very end, we're going to talk about, as I said before, there is technology out there that will change the very fabric of our reality. This is not aspirational. It's not theoretical. It's already here. It's already impacting huge parts of our society. So we're going to take a sweeping look so you can understand what's about to happen in our world. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So this is the overview. I've talked about the background. We're going to review historical cycles, as I said. Then we're going to do a situational analysis of the current cycle. We're going to look at risk identification and mitigation. Jim's going to take us through that, about some things that can help your corporate management navigate through instability. We're going to talk about financial preparedness. The strategies that we've adopted in the past are not going to work that well in this new season. So we have to prepare our companies to navigate through this. And then again, we're going to talk about that epoch-changing innovation. And I chose that word epoch very carefully. In the geological world, you know, an epoch is a big age, a big defining age, and we are changing ages in terms of technology. We're gonna look at what that means. So let's go into the next slide. Lisa. Oh, I'm sorry, gosh. So let's go back a little bit. Let's go back a couple of slides, Lisa. There we go. We're going to we're going to review historical cycles, and we're going to look at two different conceptual frameworks: the four turning, and then Ray Dalio's 6 stages of the internal cycle. So now, I'm sorry, Lisa. Now we can go ahead and go to this first one. The first one is the four turning. This is a book that I read 20 years ago when I was working in Washington, D.C. And the title is The Four Turning, an American Prophecy about what the cycles of history tell us about America's next rendezvous with destiny. And what that is, and we'll talk about it, established a framework that explained to me what was happening at that moment, and more importantly, what was yet to come. And so what's happening now, the turbulence that we're experiencing, the extreme instability, the changes in everything that we once knew, I've expected this for the last 20 years. I didn't know what form it was going to take, but I knew what it was going to feel like. I knew what the destruction it was going to hold, and I also knew the transformation that it was going to contain. And so what's happening is no surprise to me. And so we want to pass on this framework to you so you will also have this knowledge about the bigger cycles that are running through history. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So here we're going to talk about the mechanics of the four turning. And I covered this in depth in the first webinar, probably a good 20, 25 minutes. I don't have the time to go into the same depth because we've got a lot more content. So if you, at the end of this, if you want to hear more, we have a recording of this, the first webinar and also this webinar on our website, and you can go back and view it. What the mechanics of this show, I'm going to go through this slide. There are four turnings, or sometimes I call them seasons, that occur sequentially over and over again, just like the four seasons of winter, spring, summer, or fall. And each of those seasons hold different attributes. We experience different things, we act differently. Each of these turnings is 20 to 25 years. And so if you live the length of a normal human life, you're going to see all or part of all these turnings. And so we've got the first turning, which is the high. The second turning is the awakening. The third turning is the unraveling. And the fourth turning is the crisis. And we are in the crisis. We're going to talk more about what that looks like and what happens in a moment. And to give you an idea of the magnitude of what we're experiencing is that the three crises that were happened in American history before this one was the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the twin crises of the Great Depression and World War II. So that gives you an idea of the magnitude and intensity of the period that we are passing. So with that, let's go to the next slide. And this is where we're going to go into more of the details of what the turnings look like. So this describes the last four turnings, and you can see it starts with the last crisis, which was the Great Depression and World War II. From that, the nation emerged into a high. The nation reunited or had a higher degree of unity. We had come through the crisis. We put together during that time some foundational economic building blocks that would drive this economy for the next few decades. We went into the awakening from the mid-60s to the mid-80s. And then we went into the unraveling, which started during the Reagan administration and ended in 2008, when this crisis kicked off with the financial meltdown of 2008, economic crisis there. I'm going to direct my comments more, because we have just an abbreviated time with this, to the characteristics of the unraveling and the crisis, because that's what we're dealing with at the moment. Talk a little bit about the high. There's three main characteristics of the unraveling I want to talk about. One is, and it's obvious to us all, during an unraveling, by its very nature, the country devolves into ideological silos. We harden there, and all we do is yell at each other. And so the ability of society as a whole and government in general to address pressing national problems grinds to a halt. There's no consensus to be had. There's no more I need to say about that because we all have experienced that for a while. It's getting more intense, not better. But to go back to a reference point of another unraveling, which was right before the Civil War, the nation came to this same loggerhead over slavery. We got to a point where no discussion, no compromise, no legislation, no court decisions could resolve the differences. And in that particular situation, we've been into armed conflict. That doesn't mean we're going to do that now, but that was an example of going from unraveling to a crisis. And also, another characteristic of an unraveling is there are technological innovations that make the nation feel more interconnected than ever. So right before the Civil War, it was the telegraph that was invented, where we could transmit communications across the nation instantly. It was the railroad system, where we could travel rather than covered wagons. We could be places in hours or days instead of weeks or months. In the 1920s, which was the unraveling previous to this one, it was the invention of the radio and the automobile that connected society in ways that could not be imagined. And of course, in this unraveling, it was the invention of the internet and the creation of social media. And so that interconnectedness binds us all together, but it also makes it easier for us to fracture. And then finally, the characteristic of the unraveling is that it's an extended economic boom that ultimately ends up being built on a house of cards. And we saw this in the 20s, that it was the roaring 20s. It was the speakeasies. It was the flappers. The stock market increased, I think, from 1920 to 1929 by 350%. The economy expanded by 42%. A lot of that was driven by banks easing credit, so people had a lot more money to invest in the stock market. That it quickly became overvalued, and as everybody remembers, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed and lost 25% of its value in 2 days. We didn't have the regulatory framework to handle that like we do now, and so that helped usher in the Great Depression. There was no way that people in the roaring 20s could foresee what was about to befall them with a depression that almost unraveled the nation. And so we always lurch from an unraveling into a crisis, and that is of such an intensity that it feels like the nation may not survive. And so if you look back to the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Great Depression, World War II, that was a time when at certain parts of time it felt like the nation was becoming unraveled. However, crises always hold, it's a time of great peril. It is a time of destruction. It's a time when things become unwound. But as the authors of this book also stated, I'm just going to read their quote here, that 4 turnings have eventually become founding moments in America's history, refreshing and redefining the national identity. If you look at what happened after the American Revolution, a nation that was founded on democratic principles for the first time in human history was created. After the Civil War, we affirmed that all men are created equal. That's the way it was styled at that time. It would be different now. And even though we're still working through that, that was a powerful moment. At the end of the Great Depression and World War II, we emerged as the world's preeminent superpower. So once we make it through this time of turbulence, there are things, and we'll see later on in the summer, there are things headed our way that we need to prepare for a whole different season. But first, we need to navigate this season. And so the purpose of looking at these frameworks is to give you contextual awareness. And these cycles, what these 4 turnings is called the sacrum, these cycles have run throughout American history since before the country had colonies. The authors do a great job in this book of relating each of these, the high, the wake, and the route to crisis, to the events of the day. You're hearing a very tiny little summary, and there's a lot more data in the book. And I would encourage you to get it and read it if you're interested in this. But we don't want to just rely on the 4 turning as a framework. If we go to the next slide, we can see that we've got Ray Dalio's 6-stage internal cycle. And if you don't know Ray Dalio, he is a billionaire who is the co-chief investment officer of Bridgewater Associates, which is the world's largest hedge fund. He's also an incredible thought leader. If you don't follow him on LinkedIn, I would encourage you to do that. He has a book coming out in November 2021. It's The Changing World Order, Why Nations Succeed and Fail. And I'm just going to read this quote here from the book. It says, the changing world order examines history's most turbulent and political periods to reveal why the times ahead will likely be radically different from what we've experienced in our lifetimes. And so once again, to relate that back to the fourth turning, is that we all grew up, a lot of us grew up, I should say, from the mid-'80s through the 2000s in the unraveling. And there were certain social framework, or business frameworks and social contracts in the way that we related to each other that we became very familiar with. But we're moving now into a new season. And we can't take the same framework and the mores that we used in that season because we've moved from fall into winter. Winter requires an entire new framework. And I take it back. There was a story I told in the first webinar about a yellow tabby cat that adopted, came out of the forest when they had adopted. He was 6 months old, and it was early spring, and so he would come in. He would eat, sleep during the night. And at the morning when we came down the stairs, he was ready to go out. He was the king of the outdoors. He would spend all day outdoors, and come in at night again to sleep and eat. And he followed that cycle until one day he got up and there were 8 inches of snow at the door. He went, "Oh, what is this? I've never seen this before." 8 inches. It was cold and wet and awful. And he didn't know what to do. And eventually the snow and ice passed and it became warm again. And over the years, he started to learn, okay, in winter, it's like this, and that eventually passes. But since these are long tail cycles that occur over a century, we are in our very first winter. We're just like him looking at this 8 inches of snow, well, what's happening here? The purpose of these frameworks is to present us with context. We're only going to see one winter in our lifetime. We're not going to get the benefit of seeing the cycle over and over again. So we have to know where we are, the context of where, and how to get through it. And so if we look at Ray Dalio's 6-stage cycle, Lisa, let's put the first 2 stages. And the first stage is when the new order begins and the new leadership consolidates power. And stage 2 is when the resource allocation systems and government bureaucracies are built and refined. And this is very congruent with the high of the first turning when we emerge from the crisis. We restore order, things start to work a lot better. And then that leads to stage 3 where there is peace and prosperity. And this is akin to, in the 50s, we, like I said, we put the building blocks in place for a very healthy economy. And for the next 4 or 5 decades, we lived in a time of peace and prosperity. And of course, there were wars in that time, but they weren't the consuming world wars that had come before. But then, like all things, we go to the next stage, stage 4, and there are great excesses in spending and debt and the widening of wealth and political gaps. This is where we are. This is where we are today. There's no denying that. This leads, Lisa, let's put stage 5 and stage 6 on the screen. So this leads to very bad financial conditions and intense conflict. And we're going to look at where all this is leading in just a minute. And then there are civil wars and revolutions. This is the crisis that's referred to by the fourth turning. I'm not saying, of course, there's going to be civil wars and revolutions in the United States, but the intensity in the world, we'll see a lot more of that. And at the very end, we look at stage 1, where once again, the cycle starts to repeat itself. And so if we move on to the next slide, this is a great graphic that Ray put together, a great dashboard. And you can see that the columns are numbered 1 through 6, which corresponds to each stage. And the measurables are on the left. I'm not going to discuss all, but it's infrastructure and investment, productivity and output, capital allocation, cost competitive, traded capital flows. You can see in the first 3 stages, all the indicators are green. And everything's going well. And then the 4th stage, you can start to see a transition. And then 5 and 6, all indicators are flashing red. And so and that's just where we are. We're entering 5 and 6. So as thought leaders, we have to use these contextual frameworks to look at reality where it is and not where we want it to be, or not using our past to inform our present and future. Now, having said that, this is all pattern. This is about pattern recognition, and all patterns degrade over time. So we're not, VCFO is not saying this is the way that the world is going to turn out, because it may turn out differently, no matter what these frameworks. But there's enough evidence here for us to be aware of this and to look at this and to take it very seriously. So with that, we finished part one, which is the context of the historical cycles. We're going to continue to relate in webinars 3 and 4. We're going to talk more about these because we're going to get more specific about what goes on in the cycle. In the winter, you don't sell suntan lotion. And there's different strategies that are season specific that will make things easier. So with that, let's go to the next slide, and we can see, we're going to be looking here at areas of focus for our business strategies. And as I said before, in the time we have, we can't cover an A to Z list, but we're going to cover some things that we think will help you. We will get deeper into this as the webinars go on. We're going to do a situational assessment. Part of that will be an environmental scan. Jim will talk to you about risk identification and mitigation. And then we're going to talk to you about corporate readiness, the right leadership style for this season. This is a crisis. There's turbulence, there's instability, unexpected things happen all the time. We need to have the leadership style to be prepared for it. It also to be how to be financially prepared from a balance sheet standpoint and managing liquidity in an era of crisis. So with that, Lisa, let's go to the next slide. Situational, okay, so let's dive into that. Let's go to the next slide. So an environmental scan, I just picked out 6. Economic distress, social distress, cultural, technological, environmental, political distress. All of these are flashing red. I don't need to say any more. All you guys know the environment that we live in. We're experiencing extreme stress in each of these, which is a defining characteristic of the crisis. It is a time of destruction, but also intense transformation. So one of the things I decided to do was to go through, and one of the 6 was to look at the economy, the stress in the economy. So let's go to the next slide. And I'll just do a dive into that. We've got the economic dashboard as of May 21. So let's look at, on the left, you can see that this is the positive economic signs. You've got an economy that's recovering rapidly, unemployment dropping, interest rates are low, consumer spending recovering, savings rates have increased by 33% during the pandemic, according to CNBC. This is all good. Stock market valuations are very healthy. Stock market is high. Everybody's making a lot of money, no matter what you invest in, it seems like. However, if I sit through one more meeting where people say, oh, good, we've got through this, we're recovering, other than working out the work from home issues, we're getting back to normal. That is not necessarily the case, because as thought leaders, we're looking beyond conventional wisdom. And then following conventional wisdom will eventually lead you over a cliff. There are times when you benefit, there are times when it will lead you over the cliff, like it did in 2008. So the second part of this slide is called cautionary undercurrents. And these are the things, as I look at it, we're going to talk more about this in subsequent slides. We're going to talk about Federal Reserve monetary policy, ballooning U.S. government debt levels, asset valuations. And you'll see here the historically low interest rates, but you also see that on positive economic signs. And as a leader, you know that your biggest strength can also be your biggest weaknesses. And even though interest rates are low and that's helping the economies, it's building in some dynamics that are going to be very hard for us to handle going forward. So let's go to the next slide and start to look at the root cause of some of the things that we're experiencing. As everyone knows, the government had to create rescue packages very quickly and inject trillions of dollars into the economy very quickly to keep us from falling into an economic collapse that would have been very similar to the Great Depression. They did it well, they did it quickly, it was well done. However, the injection of this much money into the system so quickly starts to lead to other problems. So let's look at the next slide, where we're going to see the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve. And you can see from this that if you look at the left-hand side, there's that gray area called the recession of 2008 and 2009, when we had the credit implosion that caused the last economic crisis. And you can see from this that the Fed's balance sheet, before that, was $1 trillion. And then it jumped to 2 trillion, like doubled very quickly. Everybody freaked out. That was a huge, so the Fed created money, injected it into the financial system to keep it liquid, to keep it from locking down, to keep it from descending into a much worse economic crisis. The strategy at that point was going to be over time was to unwind it, to take that $2 trillion back to closer to 1 trillion. But as you can see from this chart, the blue line has actually increased over time. It got up to $4 trillion, which was another doubling until the pandemic hit, and then boom, it went from 4 trillion to $7 trillion. If you look at the slope of that curve during the coronavirus recession, it's extremely steep. And so that spending got us through the pandemic. But as we look at the next slide, there were some very sobering after effects of this. This is a very busy slide. Let's concentrate on just the very top graph. You can see those bars represent the levels of public debt, and the line represents GDP. You know, as everybody knows, good economic theory, you always grow. As long as your assets, your net worth, or your worth goes faster than your debt, that's normally a good thing. And that happened for the most part until the middle of the last decade when we started hitting the top of the bars. And then you can see in the last 2 years, there's been a massive shift where all of a sudden now we have almost $8 trillion more debt than we have GDP. This is a tectonic shift in the economic foundation structure of the way we run this country. Now, given the GDP will start to improve rapidly, and that gap will narrow, hopefully. But this, as Jim was saying yesterday, in one of our comments, is there's a lot of this, our ability to continue to finance our way through crisis, that may be disappearing as an option. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that on the interest payments, you can see this is another consequence. This is a slide of U.S. interest debt payments on federal debt. You can see they've grown significantly in the last few years. And the challenge here is interest rates are historically low. As they start to tick up, you're going to see this upward slope get steeper, even if we don't increase debt, which we are significantly. And so if we don't want to raise taxes and we don't want to cut spending, eventually this is going to come out into the system in a very bad way. And so as thought leaders, we've always, for the last 40 years, people have talked about the ballooning government debt and it's bad, and somehow we've always found a way to get past it, but that avenue is rapidly shifting. If this is something, and the reason I took this tack during the webinar was because this is a big one. If this shifts, it could impact us in very difficult ways. But also, as we're going to see at the very end of this webinar, there is a way out of this that where this could actually turn out, this problem could disappear and will likely do that. So I don't want, there's a lot of doom and gloom, but there is a way out of this, as we'll see. So with that, let's go to the last 3 slides before Jim comes on. I'm going to talk about asset valuation, because everybody knows when a lot of money comes into the system very quickly, you get asset bubbles. A bubble is what caused our credit crisis of 2008 and 2009. There was too much money in the system. The housing market got overheated. The valuations exceeded the home values exceeded what it was really worth. The bubble popped. There was huge destruction everywhere. So what happened? And I've lived through 4 assets. I've looked at least 4 bubbles that have popped. Some are extraordinarily painful. In the 80s, I lived through the crash of oil prices, which led to the failure of banks, eventually which brought down the real estate market. It was 3 massive pills. It was horrible. It took us 10 years to dig out. We've all experienced one in 2008 and 2009. What creates bubbles when supply money it goes into an economy very quickly? It creates asset valuation problems. And the second tab here called market psychology and emotions like greed and hurting are thought to magnify the bubble further. We're going to look at some of those that are going on right now in just a couple of slides. The root cause of this one was the massive amount of liquidity injected into the economy of the Federal Reserve. They had to do it, but now we're dealing with the after effects. So let's go to the next slide. And we can see that, bubbles, basically, the basic definition, it's a misalignment of valuation fundamentals There's different types of bubbles, commodities, stock market, economic credits. Some of the causes, right now, the big cause is monetary policy, but we're going to see in this next slide some irrational exuberance and herding behavior they're making things worse. And all of this typically leads to bad consequences. And so with this next slide, let's look at the current, I'm drilling down now here to very specific examples of asset valuation. The first three are about economic policy and fundamentals. We've got an overheated housing market. I don't need to say any more about that. Everybody knows what's going on. We went through this in 2000, in the last first decade of this century. We know how that turned out. Stock market valuation, the stock market has really been, by some really broad measures, has been overvalued for a long time, but that just continues to roll. There's some parts of the market that are valued, others that are not. We'll see how that turns out. And then interest rate risk. Interest rates, because of the amount of money in the economy, are going to start to go up. And we have an entire generation of business owners and CEOs who have never lived through that environment. They do not yet have it in their skill set. I graduated from college in the early 80s. Inflation was rampant. Interest rates were high. My first mortgage on my first house was 16%. That nature's like a pendulum. It goes back and forth. We've had low interest rates for a long time. That's going to reverse at some point, and it's going to revert throughout the economy. This last section talks about what I talk about, irrational exuberance and herding. And basically, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I want Jim to get on, but we have things like special purpose asset companies, which is basically companies that were formed without an investment purpose that people write checks to. Companies use that to launch IPOs. It's a very specific way of raising money, but we've had enormous run-ups in valuations because of that, and now it's starting to unwind. Non-fungible tokens is really, people have made money in this, but I think it's stupid. Basically, this is digital assets. It can be a picture of a painting, it can be music, it can be a video that's turned into a digital asset that's then sold. A great example of this was Jack Dorsey's first tweet. A picture of Jack Dorsey's first tweet. He's the founder of Twitter. Sold for $2.9 million. The problem with this is that there's no, and you don't, when you buy something like that, you don't get intellectual property rights. It's virtually worthless. Just another sign of things that a lot of money sloshing around the economy. Dogecoin was a cryptocurrency that was actually set up to be a satire or parody of Bitcoin in 2013, but just due to some comments on it by Elon Musk, it actually attained a market value of $73 billion on May 4th, which exceeded the market cap value of Capital One and the market cap value seen now. It is just incredible, the overvaluations there. And then everybody knows the story about Robinhood and GameStop. A bunch of people on Reddit all got together and decided to invest in GameStop. In a 4-week period from like mid-January to mid-February, GameStop went from $20 a share to $350 a share, then tumbled back to $50 a share. No change in value in the fundamentals. It's just money moving in ways that are basically stupid. So with that's a drill down of an environmental scan, and just one of the things in the environment as we look through all these different things where threats could be an issue. But that's just to give an example of how to take an overall view and then drill down into something that you feel like is a threat. With that, because we're in a very turbulent time, unexpected things happen all the time. Systemic shocks have happened more on the way, but there's more than just financial risk. There's also operational risk, there's reputation risk. Jim's going to talk about, there's heightened level. In this day and time, companies' reputation can change overnight if you're on the wrong side of an issue. It's a hard time to be a company, as Jim told me about 2 weeks ago. He's going to take us through how to establish risk procedures and processes that you can use to help your company navigate through this incredibly perilous time. Jim?
Great, thanks, Ashford. Yes, well, again, Ashford has eloquently set the scene here, and I know, at this point, knowing that we're looking at these giant macro level changes, essentially an epochal turning. If you're running a business, and we're all running businesses, it feels like I'm fighting the tide. How do I prepare for this? Can I prepare for this? Is there anything I can do? And there is, and there isn't. I mean, obviously, we all went through 2020, and none of us saw that coming. So that is an example right there. Readiness ultimately means resilience, and in helping companies through these kinds of things for longer than I'd like to acknowledge, we tend to all overestimate our capacity for resilience. We tend to all overestimate our capacity, period. We run businesses. Most of us are running smaller, medium-sized firms and all that. In order to do that well, we are by nature optimistic. By nature, we're out there and we see the positive and we grab the positive. That's good, but it also, in order to do that at a time of great change, involves a slight shift of mindset. So we'll get into the tools momentarily, but essentially what this means is adopting a culture of resilience. It takes a different way of thinking somewhat. It takes setting up the processes within your company, setting up, acknowledging the tools and working with the tools to work with things we hate to do, embracing complexity, embracing uncertainty, interdependence, vulnerability, working on longer timescales than we're used to, basically looking at the bigger picture. There are tools that can help us do that. And Lisa, if we could get those charts up here, that'd be great. Basically, the shift entails a couple of things. We're all accustomed to the classic SWOT analysis. We know, that we're on the inside looking out. What is it in my firm that is good, that is bad, that's a threat, that's a vulnerability? Where are the opportunities? We think that's a wider level approach. It kind of is, it mostly isn't. We're within our own silos. We tend to think at a fairly micro level within our industry, within our customer sets. We don't take a big picture approach simply because we think this is beyond our control. Look at the outside in next to it here, the macro level, political considerations, economic considerations, legal considerations. Ed Riefenstahl got into this, the PESTEL analysis, in some detail in the first webinar. It's a wonderful tool, but it's not stuff we like to do because it entails things that we don't really want to grapple with when we're running a company. Issues of technological transformation, of digital transformation, of diversity, of economic inequality, of social tension, of, like, what do I do with all this? How do I make sense of it? How do I bring this into the firm? How do I make decisions knowing this stuff is out there? And really the solution to that, if we go to the next slide, is really to take a more holistic approach. To do that, to actually do that as a business leader requires a shift in mindset, and it's not something we can actually escape. If you follow things on, and I'll, instead of getting into detail on this, in the interest of time, please feel free to follow up with me. There are good tools like the Trust Barometer. There are measures that are in place that show the extent to which the public, and chances are your publics, are looking to you for leadership in areas that you don't think they're looking to you for. And if you don't show that, then that's going to start to have a material impact on your business. And we're already seeing that in across many businesses. We see it with our clients. A very wise man named Ashford Chancelor put forward this quote right here in one of our earlier meetings. And that different blend of skills that is required to take a wider approach to risk and reputation that could end up being a literal life and death difference for your company is the ability to look at risk and reputation differently. And the reason we look through a reputation prism is because it is a classically holistic approach. You know, my reputation is what people say about me when I'm not in the room. What drives that is a wide variety of factors that are not just financial or economic. So, you know, we have to adopt an approach that is about resilience and not just looking at short-term material risk. We have to take a long-term approach versus a short-term approach. That's hard. That could mean putting off maximizing returns in the short run, knowing that I'm going to need, you know, that winter is coming and that I'm going to need to work a little differently. It means accepting instability over stability, just acknowledging that I really can only look so far forward in a way that where I can have absolute certainty. And then looking systemically, going back to that PESTLE analysis of looking at a wider macro level system in which my company and I operate, a wider societal approach and my role in that versus just, you know, looking at the next quarter's financials. So if we move to the next slide, that's you know, really synthesizing that outside-in approach instead of using the pure SWOT analysis, day-to-day, inside-out, my company versus the world perspective is a key reputation driver. It makes you aware of these macro level trends, but in particular, the actual impact they have on business. Reputation forces an emphasis on my values, my integrity. What is the purpose of my company beyond just, you know, maximizing returns? You know, it's a, where do I fit in the big picture? And for years, this was put in the context of stuff, you know, either philanthropy or corporate social responsibility. It is not that at all. This is now kind of about the DNA of your company, who you are. And, you know, we're not used to thinking that way. And so there's a shift of approach that we're seeing increasingly really yields a return. It's and more than anything else prepares us for the road ahead, or for the uncertain road ahead. If we go to the next slide, you know, business owners, you know, and business leaders tend to focus purely on risk. I won't get into this in detail. Kingsbrae has a white paper on this very topic that we'd love to share, so you can follow up with me afterwards. But essentially, as leaders, we tend to fall into three types of myth when it comes to corporate reputation. Just in the same way we think that we're better prepared for crisis than we tend to be, we generally think our reputation is better than it actually is. That's depressing, but that's not fun to think about. But the reason we do is very natural and very human and very characteristic of companies. You know, we're well known. We think we have a good reputation. We think we're pretty hot stuff, and we get to make that call. Well, we don't. And in particular, if I'm ticking all the boxes on managing risk, you know, operations risk, supply chain risk, I'm looking in all my different little silos. Well, then I've got this covered, but we don't have it covered. And we found that out in 2020, and we found it out in 2008. And to Ashford's point, it seems like we have to be reminded of this every few years or decades. And, you know, there's a great culling of companies every time these crises hit, and we're not prepared. And, you know, we as business leaders don't want to be in, you know, amongst the winnowing of the herd. So if we go to the next slide, really that looks at, you know, there are different methodologies and different structures that can help us incorporate this approach. So the one I like, and that where we work with a lot of clients on this is, and even from the smallest firms to the largest corporations, this is an approach that tends to work. And this is not our invention. It's an Irish academic named Sean Lyons created a structure called corporate defense management. So, as he says, it's not his phrase, but offense, wins games, defense wins championships, and that is the good thing about that is that it's a methodology for resilience and preparation to get through any type of crisis. So it really is an integration of all these different factors. Again, I'm happy to follow up. Sean has a very boring but very informative video on this topic that is definitely worth your 7 or 8 minutes to truly understand. Any company can integrate these factors. And of course, as you look at this chart, you can see all the key buttons that are hit, from material risk to assurance, meaning that's how you engage your engagement with employees in the outside world, to intelligence, meaning how do you use data internally. And we live in an era of big data. We don't live in a era of big intelligence. So how do you make this work? How do you integrate it into the firm, and how do you bring it home? As we all know, in order for something like this to truly be operational, it takes leadership. So if we go to the next slide, well, I'll skip through this in the interest of time. The reason we don't do it, and the reason leaders don't do it, generally has to do with each of the items you saw on that little chart are mostly, in most companies, exist either in silos or are ignored totally. So that the word hubris there has a lot to do with it. We tend to be a little overconfident. Go on to the next slide. And really, it comes down to leadership. And Ashford will get into this momentarily, but really, every type of leader can build a resilience strategy that will help mitigate the risks and build reputation. So while the best fits do tend to be people who are by nature big picture people, are by nature comfortable with transformation and change, or by nature willing to be out on a limb, it is much harder if, as a business leader, you are more comfortable buried in the spreadsheets, looking at the next transaction, the next deal, or tending to be a little more hands-off and just letting my people get on with what they do. It doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means that it's going to take more of a leap to get there, primarily as a C-suite person, primarily in your mind, but it is definitely possible. Risk management, risk awareness comes from the top. Survival comes from the top. The structures and tools, though, are there for anybody to incorporate. So as long as there's awareness, and as long as there's character and integrity, you can transcend the rest. So if we move on to the next slide, there are different processes that building on Sean Lyons' corporate defense structure can be incorporated very easily. Again, it comes from the C-suite. You could form a cross-functional committee. Everybody loves a committee, but it has to be something where the CEO is driven. We do this for actual crises and crisis planning, crisis management, when you're looking at physical crises or financial crises. This is much the same thing. It just takes a more holistic approach. Making it in people's interests to think about reputation and risk is obviously incentivizing people accordingly. Having a third party or outside advisor, I would say that, wouldn't I? But in fact, there's a good argument to having somebody be Switzerland in building. In the case of our firm, we have a quarterly reputational health assessment process. That's that QRHA process that is essentially just where we have a team that works with the C-suite to analyze risk, to ask the uncomfortable questions, to be the outside looking in, that takes a structured approach, and it ensures that nothing falls off the table, and it ensures that things don't fall through the cracks. So if we move to the next slide, this is essentially what that looks like. We've developed this methodology based on work I did with the Federal Reserve System during the last financial crisis, and it's really just a way of bringing in environmental, societal, geopolitical behavior, all the factors we identified that Ed Riefenstahl talked about last time, the PESTLE analysis factors, bringing that into your own risk management process and having a risk management process. Again, looking beyond compliance and making sure that there is a mission and purpose to the company, that your reputation is solid and that is aligned as you move forward. This is all about resilience. This is all about surviving these giant macro level trends and the micro level threats that come about as a consequence. So if we go to the next slide, this is where I'll hand it back to Ashford, because here this is where if it comes from the CEO, it cascades to the management. And this is where your management team is absolutely critical. Small and medium-sized businesses in particular sometimes have blinkers on when it comes to this. And this is where, again, Ashford will walk us through how we can understand who we have and how we can maximize who we have. Ashford, back over to you.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate that. We're about 4 minutes from the top of the hour. We may run 5 minutes longer on this webinar than we anticipated. It's been so content heavy, but I promise you, if you have that 5 minutes, extra 5 minutes to stick around, the last couple of slides will be worth it. So I'm going to move very quickly to wrap this up. But as Jim said, navigating, this is a point in time when you have to know how your management team is wired. When the military trains their special operations group, they know exactly what the strengths, what the weaknesses are of all your team members, and who is best at what. There is a lot of different personality, talent, capability assessments out there. I've mentioned 2 here because I have personal experience with personality and culture index. The aspect, we'll talk about this more in the next webinar, but the aspect I'm talking about here is the ability of people on your management team to scan the environment, to be able to identify opportunities and threats, and to bring them back to the management team. There are certain people that are wired to do that the best, and there are certain people that don't have that ability. You need to know how you need to know how your people are, because identification of threats and opportunities right now is more critical and important than ever before. One of the things I know this person, he's mentioning the culture index. He is tested out as a visionary and a visionary and a transformational visionary. He had the ability to go out and identify these things. He would frequently bring them back to the management team, who would poo-poo his ideals because they were not wired to understand what he was saying. And it typically had very bad consequences. They missed out on some great opportunities. Know how your management team is wired. Not all people participating in strategic planning have the same ability to do it. And I'll close with this book. It's just released by Michael Lewis. It's a premonition of pandemic story. He's the author of The Big Short. And then he talks about a handful of doctors, academics, and government officials who anticipated the COVID-19 pandemic and were alternately successful and stymied by systemic factors. The ability of your team to anticipate the next systemic shock is critical. And if you know how they're wired, it's going to help significantly. So I'm going to go over these last few slides very quickly. One of the things we can go to, actually the next, we're talking about financial readiness. One of the things that is one of my pet peeves in the financial world is that we are taught, and we have been taught from college, that we have to grow a certain amount year over year. We have to have 40% year over year increase in revenue, a 20% increase year over year in EBITDA. We've got to show that cycle because that is the way that if you're building a company for valuation, EBITDA, a certain growth in EBITDA is what you're achieving. But what that leaves out in terms of there's more valuations on enterprise value than just EBITDA, as we just saw. In this last pandemic, we saw a startling lack of liquidity on the use of American corporations, because we are taught to invest our profits to grow, 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 grow. And as a result, we had a systemic shock, and tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of businesses were lost and aren't coming back. A lot of those business owners had put their heart and soul into increasing their business valuations, but it didn't have the liquidity to weather a crisis. We are in that period where if you have that liquidity kicked out from under you, you don't have, it doesn't matter what your growth in EBITDA has been, what your growth in revenue has been. So very quickly, I'm going to spend the last 2 or 3 minutes talking about this visual balance sheet that I developed for some of my clients. And most CEOs don't have the technical ability, nor should they, to understand the liquidity of a balance sheet. And so I developed this visual dashboard that will show you very quickly where your liquidity is. You can see it works on current assets and current liabilities. There's no to our balance sheet than that. But if you look at the current assets, we've got cash, receivables, prepaids, stock inventory. And, you know, it's on a balance sheet, it's matching up the liquidity of assets to make sure that you have enough liquidity, time to liquidity versus time to maturity for your liabilities, to make sure that as your liabilities mature, you have enough cash to meet that. In this particular situation, on the asset side, it's green. The darkness or the shade of green talks about how quickly these assets can be have liquidity. Cash is always has great liquidity. Receivables has a little bit less. Stock inventory, which is the inventory that you anticipate to sell, which has less liquidity. On a liability side, you can see that accounts payable always has the shortest term to maturity, within weeks. Payroll is the same way. Short-term debt and a current portion of long-term debt always have different maturities throughout the year, and so they have a longer term to maturity. So if you look at this and the size of the boxes, it relates to the degree of liquidity and also to the amount of cash, receivables, and marketable securities accounts that you have on your balance sheet. So this is a dashboard that will very quickly tell a CEO where, if he has any liquidity issues. This particular one is asset heavy. You can look very quickly to see they have enough in cash to pay for their entire payables and payroll expenses before they even had to go to the receivable. They don't have a liquidity gap. On the next slide, we'll see what I call it's a neutral slide, and you can see that it's balanced, and this doesn't really exist in nature, but this is for illustration purposes where they've got adequate liquidity to meet all their needs. And the next slide, which is where the alarm bells start going off, is that this is liability heavy. So you can see just by visual dashboard, without having to get into the numbers, that you're going to have significant liquidity problems. Your payables, you don't have enough cash or receivables to meet your payables. So this allows the CEO a visual dashboard to very quickly grasp where you are in liquidity on your balance sheet. I've used this with several clients. They love it. If you want to reach out to me, I can help you set this up and design it, because the CEOs that I work with that have used this really like it. With that, I'm going to move into the final part, or a couple of last slides. We're going to talk about in the next 2 minutes about the innovation, the rate of innovation, and what we're seeing. And once again, we are establishing, as we come out of this crisis, the economic building blocks for the next economy, as we've done as we have emerged from each crisis. Except this time it's different, because the technology, the innovation is coming in. It will, once again, you're going to hear this, it will change the fabric of our reality. So let's go to this next slide, because this is a good dashboard for people to see. This is not all in the scope of what we're looking at here. We've got quantum computing, we've got synthetic biology, we've got artificial intelligence, virtual reality, genetic engineering, 3D printing. As we go forward, these are going to make profound changes in our lives. They have already made significant changes in sections of society, haven't made it all the way through yet. But if you're in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, you're going to see a profound change as these things start to become more penetrate society at a deeper level. And then when they start to synthesize, like for example, when artificial intelligence starts to inform quantum computing, that's when we start to reach the sci-fi futures, or the futures that we've read in science fiction books. Now, quantum computing is a little ways off. Some of these are more present than others, but it's coming. This will once again transform the nature of our reality and become the economic building blocks for the next huge expansion of the economy. And this goes back to when I look at that slide that shows that our debt now exceeds our GDP. This is something where it could reverse in time because of the enormous economic creation that's going to come from this. The last slide shows just 3 different examples of what makes this real. One is a brain implant that translates spots of writing into text on computers. That's here. The next one shows that the Navy controls inventions that claim to change the fabric of reality, and it relates to how will they generate energy. They have patents on that will do that. And then 2 is that this is an article from Harvard about quantum computing. So a lot of people read about this and it's very interesting, but they don't necessarily have the ability to see how it's going to translate into massive changes in our society. So with that, we've run about 6 minutes over. I apologize for that. We had a lot of content. We have another webinar coming up in the July-August timeframe, one in October, November. We also want to, we spent 2 webinars presenting to you a lot of content, but it's time now for us to shift into a more interactive format. So we are going to be hosting some Zoom calls where we put out 2 or 3 topics from this series, and we bring in people who are interested to discuss these trends. Jim and I will host that and facilitate the conversations where we start to talk to each other, because the ideas that we create will illuminate alternatives paths that we don't currently know about. And then once again, we'll be launching a LinkedIn community group where we can also discuss these things on social media. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we ran over. We hope it's worth your time, and we will see you at the next one. Thank you very much.